Before we start this episode, I just sort of wanted to mention a few things today. I occasionally get comments wondering things about Chrontendo, like where episode 1 is and that sort of thing, and I guess I have not actually done the very best job in promoting the fact that there is in fact a Chrontendo blog, which actually has been in existence for longer than I've been posting videos on YouTube. I post entries on the blog on a pretty regular basis discussing how the new episodes are coming along, as well as discussing other topics. I posted a link here to the Chrontendo frequently asked questions, which I've updated recently, and this might be able to answer some general questions about what Chrontendo is, and where it came from, and where it'll be going, and all that sort of thing, so by all means check it out. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Chrontendo episode 46. Last episode we covered all the Japanese games of June 1989. Now before heading on to July, we need to take a quick look at the US only games. At this point, the hugeness of the Nintendo Entertainment System in the United States had reached the point where in any given month, there were just as many games released in the US as there were in Japan. Sometimes more. In June 1989 we saw only 5 Japanese Famicom games. In the US, there were about 15 for that month, 4 US-only releases, and around 11 games that were already previously released on the Famicom. And these included Mega Man 2, Bayou Billy, Super Dodgeball, a really new game, Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and a virtual antique, Hydlide. You can now just see how crazy and mixed up the US release schedule was, with Hydlide hitting shelves the same month as Mega Man 2. No wonder people hate Hydlide so much. Anyway, let's check out the 4 non-Japanese games released for June, and they include a very weird game that is a personal favorite. Alright, opening up a new episode with a game from Acclaim. That's certainly a good sign. Here's Alex Cord giving you your orders. Not the most aesthetically pleasing piece of art I've ever seen. Old school printer paper. You younger kids might not recognize that. There's the Airwolf logo, the wolf in sheep's clothing. Whoa, things are moving quickly here. I'm not pressing any buttons, the game just wants to throw up each screen for about 1 second for some reason. That's as much as I know. What? You haven't told me anything yet. Alright, so Airwolf is taking off, and, it's one of these games, sort of like Top Gun. So it appears I have to rescue prisoners. I'll assume that the stick figure on the map there is the prisoners. You have 2 weapons, a machine gun type thing, and a fully guided missile. Okay, so get this, you actually speed up by hitting the start button. I love action games that make you use the start button in-game. Alright, so I'm headed towards the prisoners, and here we are. And what? Airwolf is not the most intuitive game on the NES. You're probably going to have to read the instruction manual to figure out what to do when it comes to the controls, and how to play to avoid dying all the time. If this sounds a lot like a computer game, then you will not be surprised to know this was a product of a computer game developer, Beam Software, who were based out of Australia. They were the guys behind the hugely successful Hobbit adventure game, one of the biggest selling computer games of the time. We took a quick look at the Hobbit back in our adventure game history special. They also created a Karate Champ knockoff called Way of the Exploding Fist, which became an enormous commercial hit in the United Kingdom. It's basically the Street Fighter II of the mid-80s British computer scene. It appears that Airwolf was Beam's first console game. They would go on to specialize in crap, ports and licensed games with such stuff as the Nintendo Entertainment System Back to the Future, Dash Galaxy, and oddly the Super Nintendo version of Shadowrun. Note to self, insert wacky record scratch sound effect here. So Airwolf, once you reach the hostages and that screen appears, you immediately have to start hitting the up button, or your helicopter will plummet to the ground like a rock and explode. You land by just sort of tapping the up button a few times to slow your descent. The question is, why did they put this in? I mean, once you know how not to die instantly, there's really no challenge compared to the rest of the game. It's simply a matter of pressing up a couple times. If Beam didn't really want to put in like a real minigame, Why not just use a cutscene? This is like video game busy work. It's a pointless attempt to sort of add a little content to a game with very little content. And that's really all there is to the game. There's 20 levels altogether. Later ones become much more difficult with more prisoners to rescue, tougher enemies, and you'll need to worry about refueling between the prison camps, but really we've sort of seen the gist of the game here. Incidentally, this is the second Airwolf game we've covered. In episode 40, there was the Japanese-only release, and that was like a regular horizontal shooter. It was sort of awful, but I guess it was more interesting than this. I believe we have 3 Tosa-developed games today. First up is Shooting Range. I'll confess to actually liking that goofy music. Okay, 2 options here. Normal, that's creative, and Party. And these are the difficulty levels. Alright, so let's begin. This is a light gun game, as you figured out by looking at the cover art a moment ago, which prominently features the zapper. When a game is called Shooting Range and the box art is just some screenshots that are almost completely obscured by a photo of a hand holding the zapper, then you suspect that you were in for a very quickly made generic game. The selling point of Shooting Range is simply that you can use the zapper. Stage 1 has a Western theme. Naturally, you shoot at Indians. Haha, what fun. When you see an Indian walking by, sort of minding his own business, fire a shot over his head and watch him scurry away. What a great message to send to the kids, Bandai. The actual object is to shoot those little peppermint candy targets and rack up points. Get enough points and you'll finish the level. If your energy or time runs out, the game ends. You lose energy when you miss, which will happen, but some enemies drop energy refills, and just as importantly, some drop extra time in the form of an hourglass. Now during level 2 you might experience a problem. You can't rack up enough points. Monsters seem to arrive slowly, and even if you hit every one, you still can't get close to the 7,000 points required to complete this level. In fact, sometimes monsters just stop appearing entirely, and you'll sit watching an empty screen as the time runs out. Just sitting there helpless, waiting for something to shoot. But the solution to this is use the D-pad to move the camera. Yep, you can pan around and shoot more monsters. Suddenly it becomes a piece of cake. Brilliant. So Shooting Range is one of those games that makes you use the zapper and the D-pad simultaneously. For someone like me, who's an expert marksman, this is a real problem, since for maximum proficiency when playing a zapper game, I use a double-handed grip and a weaver stance, the whole 9 yards. Having to fiddle with a D-pad really messes up my mojo. This bonus round involves you shooting out bottles. The next level is a space-themed level and features lots of rip-offs from the Alien movies. The Alien second jaw seems to be coming out of its back. It's a hell of a way to screw things up, Tosa. And the party game is just a weird whack-a-mole game. So yeah, it's a lame zapper game. Let's move on. Okay, now here we have a wild game. This is one crazy looking title screen. Monster Party, published by Bandai and developed by Human. For some reason this was only released in the US. I have no idea why. Man, look at Mark just walking down the street like he owns it. He's got some serious swagger going on. That must be why he was chosen to help fend off an alien invasion. Kind of weird that he was looking right at the star but somehow doesn't notice it descending from the sky and landing right in front of him. You know, I wonder if there's a name for this kind of humor, where the fantastic and the mundane are kind of mixed together in an unexpected or absurd way, like an alien named Bert. You see it a lot in stuff like Alf or Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or even in artier things like Sartre's No Exit. This is a pretty cool intro. There's little bits of animation added in. It's not exactly Ninja Gaiden, but better than the typical stuff Bandai was putting out. Human Entertainment was definitely the good developer that Bandai used a lot, as opposed to Tosa, the bad developer. Human worked on several of those family trainer games, and later they did stuff like Fire Pro Wrestling, and of course they returned to horror themes in Clock Tower. Monster Party is sort of the one of the defining examples of a cult classic on the NES. It's not a great game from a technical or mechanical perspective. I mean, it's not Super Mario 3 or Mega Man 2, but it's so weird and different that I can't help but sort of love it, and kind of hate it at the same time. Right from the start, this looks pretty weird. You have enemies who are guys buried upside down in the ground. And your weapon is used in a pretty unusual fashion. It's a baseball bat, which can of course be used to beat the enemies with, but also you can hit enemy projectiles just like they were baseballs. So if someone shoots a laser at you, you can swing the bat and knock it right back at them and kill them. When it comes to having lots of bosses, Monster Party absolutely does not fool around. This first boss is clearly inspired by Little Shop of Horrors, and sort of trains you on the whole baseball bat mechanic. You need to swat those bubbles right back at it. One frustrating thing is you can't really predict at what angle the bubbles are going to be returned at. Some will hit the monster, others will sail right above it or below it. Killing a boss will net you a mystery item. Sometimes it's points, other times it's a health refill. You never know. Certain enemies will drop hearts, which refill your health. As you can see, your life bar down at the bottom there actually has the potential to be pretty long when all filled up. And some enemies will drop what looks exactly like a standard pharmaceutical capsule. This transforms you into Bert, who can't use the baseball bat but instead fires lasers and can fly. Monster Party has a lot of really weird stuff in it. One of the most infamous bits is the second boss, who is already dead and attracting flies when you reach him, but is still able to talk somehow. Pretty creepy. Still, Monster Party's tone is relatively cute and friendly, little smiley faces everywhere, until you reach this giant Hanawa type thing, which looks sort of like a cactus, and we get one of the great what the fuck moments of 8-bit gaming. Holy cow, look at all those rotting and bloody heads. You would think Nintendo of America would have not given the seal of approval to something like this, but some publishers managed to get away with a lot more than others, and Bandai, I'm sure, sold a lot of games for the system. Perhaps they got a bit of special treatment. Most levels have 3 bosses. Here's the last of the first level. As a rule, if you are if you are in Bert form when you fight a boss, you can generally just sort of power your way through the boss using the laser, as opposed to using the bat, which will normally take much longer. Defeating the last boss here gives you the key needed to exit the level. Look at the screen between levels. Skeletons in a pool of blood. Now, the settings used for the levels in this game don't really make much sense. Here, for example, we have a sewer, but at least Human Entertainment did not use the same enemies over and over again. Each level has brand new monsters. But Monster Party is mostly remembered for its extensive collection of bosses, most of which are pretty strange. None more so than this trio of fried foods that attack you. First of all, tempura shrimp, then an onion ring, and then whatever this is, maybe tonkatsu on a skewer or something. You'll have to fight these guys as Mark, because you won't, even if you are actually Bert when you enter the boss battle, you won't last long enough in Bert's form to kill all 3 of them. Level 3 gets pretty spooky, with these sort of macrocephalic skeletons popping up. Bosses include a minotaur who throws out cute little cows at you. We also have a mummy who states that his legs are asleep and throws bandages at you. I hope that those are bandages. And a giant spider, and it's not clear whether or not this is the same type of creature that was found dead in the first level. Some folks seem to think that it is, others think that that dead creature was something else entirely. I love this giant empty samurai armor who states he's a slowpoke. He even sort of admits he's a lame boss. As Bert, he's super easy. This is the Egyptian-themed pyramid level. It's funny how so many video games have an Egyptian level, as compared to, say, every other ancient civilization. Hearts, or the health refills, are found pretty frequently, and here's the thing, enemies respawn, including those who drop health. So you can sort of farm health refills when you find an enemy that actually drops them. You can kill it, go screen over, come back, kill them again, and get another health refill. You can do this several times in a row, usually. This guy is pretty amazing. It's a cute-looking cat that sort of sends demon cats at you. Not that long ago, a Japanese prototype was discovered of the game. It exists only in private hands, but since then people have realized that some of the bosses were more clearly based on copyrighted horror movies, and these were changed for the actual US release. The cat, for example, may have been based on Gremlins. The kittens actually look like Gremlins, and the big cat has like that distinctive white stripe on its head. This guy is great, a punk rocker dude. I don't want to get too pretentious here and call Monster Party a postmodern game or anything like that. There are some moments that sort of turn video game conventions onto their head. Like the dead boss we saw earlier, or these guys, dancing zombies. And they just stand there and don't attack you. You can kill them if you want, but they just keep coming back to life, so to speak. So what do? Well, absolutely nothing. After a minute or so of uninterrupted dancing, they'll just collapse, and you've beaten the boss. This rather peaceful-looking water level seems out of place, but it does have this rather marvelous enemy, a small fish disguising itself as a shark. This guy is a thinly disguised take on Daimajin, the giant stone warrior from the 1960s monster movies. The next level is the most despised of the game, a haunted house, and it's just one of those big ol' confusing mazes with doors that warp you around all over the place. Now once you've actually figured out the correct path to take, it's actually quite easy. But that awful wind sound effect will drive you crazy. There's only one boss on this level, but good lord, what sort of madness is this? It turns out the actual boss that you have to kill is one of the faces, the rest are sort of like all harmless fakes, but the way they blend in with the background when not moving makes them hard to actually find. This has got to be about one of the freakiest looking video game boss battles ever. The penultimate level is vertical, and filled with some terrible puns, like we have the Elephant Man, and an umpire as opposed to a vampire. The first boss is of course a caterpillar named Royce, who rolls himself into a ball and charges at you. That's pretty funny, Rolls Royce. Then it's the Grim Reaper himself. Like so many other bosses, he's stationary, and you kill him by batting stuff back at him. As a bird though, you can just sort of fly up and laser him to death. Now, the game does a major screw you with this boss. After fighting the second boss, the Grim Reaper, you obtain the key needed to exit the level. But when you get to the third boss, which is actually Spider number 2, he even has a number 2 on his abdomen, when you kill him, you lose the key, which is a pretty terrible thing to do to you as a player. The last level takes into more familiar 8-bit video game territory, castles and clouds and that sort of crap, but still the bosses are freaky. Just look at those eyes staring at you. And now one eye is missing. The Flying Dragon here is actually one of the toughest bosses because he just totally rides your ass. I don't know of any smart way to fight him, other than just sort of, stocking up on health and then sort of crossing your fingers and hope that you kill him before he kills you. Mark Soup. How do they know Mark's name? This guy appears to be sort of like a giant mummified pharaoh head on a tiny body. Alright, so at last we've reached the end of our journey. Yeesh, now we get to see his full face. This guy reminds me of something I've seen before, like in an old silent movie or something. He looks sort of like the face of Moloch in Metropolis, but I don't think that's what I'm thinking of. I can't quite figure out what he reminds me of. He's going to be either easy or long and difficult, depending on how often his weak spot opens up. Okay, so once you defeated him, we now get to reward ourselves with the utterly creepy and batshit insane ending. Whoa, so how old is Mark supposed to be again? Seems like kind of a strange thing to give a young boy. And then it gets worse. Holy crap. I can't really think of very many other video game endings from, the 8-bit era that are quite as disturbing as this one. It sort of implies that Mark is trapped in like a Groundhog Day-like eternal loop of horror and death. And I know that Monster Party is not, technically speaking, a great game. Much of the platforming parts are pretty routine and uninspired, but it's just so weird and different that I can't help but kind of like it. I mean, it's really much more creative than all the other terrible crap Bandai was putting out at this time, so I really kind of wonder why its Japanese release was cancelled. It's not really a very hard game to find. I mean, people sometimes refer to it as an obscure game, but it seems to have been put out in pretty big numbers, and you can get copies pretty cheap, so if you never played this game, I would definitely recommend looking at it. Aw, how wonderful! Another Epic's computer game ported to the NES by Rare. You might be aware that I am not fond of this series, and it seems like we've already seen so many of these. Winter games, world games, summer games, California games. Yes, we already covered California games on the Sega Master System. That was way back in Chrontendo episode 7. So if you don't watch the Chrontendo videos, or just have a bad memory, like me, this is a collection of several little games that revolve around the sort of fun activities that we do out here in California, supposedly, like skateboarding, roller skating, frisbee, and so on, though the game can't actually use the word frisbee since that is a registered trademark. The game is notable for the spectacular number of real-life companies that appear as sponsors in the game. OP, Kawasaki, Santa Cruz Skateboards, Casio, and Milton Bradley, who of course was the actual publisher of this game. They were also the ones who published the NES version of World Games, which was also ported by Rare. As I've bitched about before, while covering other Epic games and stuff like Skate or Die, the main issue here is trying to figure out how the controls work and how the timing of the controls work. These games have weird, overly complicated and tricky to use control schemes. Even if you know what the buttons do, you'll have to spend some time figuring out the exact timing of the button presses. So even if you know that you have to, say, hit the A button and the left button to do a particular trick, you'll still fall down a bunch of times trying to discover exactly when you need to hit those buttons in order to successfully perform the trick. Now of course this is not really a requirement in sports games. Plenty of games, from Excitebike to Punch-Out to Tecmo Bowl, have these really easy to use intuitive controls. The design philosophy behind California games is the exact opposite of that in those games. Like I said, we covered the Master System version earlier. It didn't really look that much better than this, nor did it play any better. Rare here certainly did not try to improve California games as far as I can tell. Anyway, I'm sure this cart sold pretty well since it was a huge hit on computers, but I think we can sort of safely sweep this one under the rug now. But the good news is, this is the very last one of these games on the NES, as far as I know. Moving on to July, we have a decent selection of titles, nothing too crazy. Pretty cool game from Capcom, a beat 'em up, couple RPGs. Let's take a look. Okay, this is a bit of a confusing title screen. This is the 6th game in Jellicoe's Moero series, though there's that one character that looks sort of like a 3. The title is actually Shin Moero Pro Yakyuu, or New Moero Pro Baseball. This is the 3rd Moero baseball game, The first two were from 1987-88 respectively, and they were released in the US as Bases Loaded. This game was not released in the US. Bases Loaded 3 was based on the fourth Moero Pro Yakyuu game. Now, the Famicom game list that I have posted on the Chrontendo blog states that this game actually was Bases Loaded 3, but the author of that list was not correct, and don't blame me because I'm actually not the one who put that list together. Though I am of course often confused in my own special way. Alright, did I mention that the game uses the player's biorhythms? Now, if you don't know what a biorhythm is, then congratulations, you were probably not alive in the 70s. Though why biorhythms are turning up in a video game in 1989 is anybody's guess. By the way, the biorhythm theory was invented by Sigmund Freud's crazy buddy Wilhelm Fliess, who also theorized people's mental problems came from their nose, and was an avid supporter of cocaine for medical purposes. Those of you familiar with the Bases Loaded series will recognize that Jalico and developer Tosa kind of switched things up a bit here. Instead of doing the old behind-the-picture view from the first two games, we now have this odd oblique angle view, which makes the pitching mound look hilariously close to the batter. Like in most baseball games on the Famicom, you're going to hit an extraordinary number of foul balls. You also have that same damned annoying Oenden music constantly playing in the background. There are the usual problems, that when the CPU hits a ball, you can't see your outfielders until the ball is already all the way out there, so it's really hard to get them in place to catch the ball. Naturally, the CPU's outfielders will have no problem with this. I'm not sure why Jalico didn't release this in the US, though actually Jalico seemed on the verge of actually abandoning the series in the US for a while. Bases Loaded 2 came out in 1990, but number 3 wasn't released until 1993, which was obviously pretty near the end of the system's lifespan. Anyway, as to this one not coming out in the US, it's not really a huge loss. Second game of July is Igo-Shinan from Hector, aka Hect. I've noticed all the Hector games have that thing in the upper left corner, not sure why. Well, Igo-Shinan is another Ego game with an unpleasant droning soundtrack. Igo-Shinan means Ego instruction, so this is a game that teaches you how to play Ego. There's a bunch of options here, which control how much guidance the game gives you. You'll see what I mean in just a sec. Go is a strategic board game from the days of ancient China. In Japan it's often called Ego, for some damn reason. The object is to surround your opponent's pieces in order to capture them. Players alternate placing pieces on the board. The first Famicom Go game was from Bulletproof Software and came out in 1987. It was supposedly the only video game that Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi ever played. Now there was another Go game from Namco, released in March 1989, but Igo-Shinan must become pretty popular, since they released a sequel for it about once a year and became like the main Ego series on the Famicom. As you can see, the computer gives you hints. It offers two choices, one optimal and one not so optimal. You can also set it to offer you up to 5 choices, or even 0, which is basically just playing Go against the computer. I suppose the computer giving me hints is the only way that I could possibly beat the CPU, since I know nothing of Go strategy. Even with the hints, however, the CPU did completely kick my butt. Oh well. Still, it's a good idea. I mean, the idea of just playing a board game against a computer is sort of silly, but this actually kind of makes sense, a video game that teaches you the strategy of playing the game. Don't know how helpful this really was when it comes to learning how to be a good Go player, but at least it seems like a reasonable effort. From Namco, we have Dragon Ninja, another game with no music whatsoever during the intro. Namco's on a bit of a roll lately, with releases coming out quite frequently. We actually have another Namco game released exactly 1 week after Dragon Ninja. Dragon Ninja did receive a US release, and I'm sure you recognize this screen right here. Yeah, Data East published it in the US as Bad Dudes, again with an eerily silent title screen. The US version chose to drop the music in place of this annoying sort of typing sound effect. I have no idea who this guy is, but he utters one of the most iconic lines in 8-bit gaming. Yes, I am a bad enough dude. I hope. Bad Dudes is a single-plane beat-em-up in the pre-Renegade tradition. It reminds me a lot of Irem's Vigilante. You have an attack button, a jump button. The attack button does produce quite a few different results, like a low kick, high kick, punch, etc. And you can use both buttons together to do like this spinning kick. Bad Dudes was originally an arcade game from 1988. You can see the New Yorker Hotel in the background. I stayed there once. The US arcade version was given the name Bad Dudes vs. the Dragon Ninja, but this was of course shortened for the NES game. If anything, the arcade's intro is even better. It's not just the President, but President Ronnie. The arcade and home versions are actually quite similar, but obviously the original looks quite a bit nicer. The truck is moving here, it's parked in the NES version, and Karnov is the first boss. That's sort of a nice callback to an earlier Data East game. There was some decent use of multiplane scrolling. This certainly wasn't the best or most popular beat-em-up at its time, but the cheesy plot gave it a certain amount of appeal. Now, the NES version is much more well-known, but it's not quite the game that the arcade Bad Dudes is. It's harder in some ways. In the first level, those black-suited ninjas are really annoying. They often appear at the edge of the screen and then very quickly toss a throwing star at you. These guys were a bit slower in the arcade version and you had more time to react. Karnov is a bit tougher as well. Your attacks have virtually no range, so you need to be almost touching him when you throw a punch if you want to connect. He seems also maybe a little faster and less predictable. The great I'm bad after defeating a boss is retained from the arcade game. I'm bad. Level 2 is probably the highlight. First of all, it takes place on top of a moving big rig. No explanation for this is given or needed. You're just fighting ninjas on an 18-wheeler. This level is a bit easier since the ninjas tend to jump up from the ground, so you can position yourself to hit them as they're in mid-jump and thus helpless. Also, the Castlevania-inspired music is really cool. The truck actually says dudes on it. Is this your truck? Do the Bad Dudes own a trucking company? This boss can be defeated in a somewhat cheesy way, standing on the truck and then sort of hitting him as he jumps up over and over again. Now, I'd like to be able to report that Bad Dudes is a classic on level of Contra or Ninja Gaiden, but actually it's pretty mediocre. The level design is pretty boring, you're mostly just walking around on flat surfaces, and occasionally you need to like jump up or down one level or something. Oh, here's the sewer level. This boss is pretty easy if you have the nunchucks. There's only 2 weapons in the entire game, nunchucks and the dagger. Stick with the nunchucks. Level 4 looks like it's ripped straight out of Contra. The level design is much simpler than in Contra though, it's pretty much like I said, just walking in a straight line along the ground. The next level is a rehash of level 2, but now it's on a train. The music is even the same. After this we have the boss's underground headquarters. All the levels look sort of boring, have pretty limited color palettes. I mean, that would be okay if the game itself were more interesting, but aside from the truck and the train stages, there's really nothing going on visually. Even worse, the enemies are the same in each stage. Very few new enemies are introduced throughout the game. Even on the last level, it's just the same old ninjas we've been seeing over and over again. Every once in a while you'll see something different, like the mass of ninjas waiting for you here, but really Bad Dudes is pretty repetitive. Okay, so finally you reach this elevator, and out comes this guy. Bad Dudes ends with a boss rush. You face each boss from the earlier levels, though in greatly weakened form. This guy's a piece of cake. You can take quite a few hits before dying, and there's generally health refills in each level, and once you run out of lives, you have several continues. I've never played the game until now, and on this last level, I was a couple punches away from killing the final boss the first time I encountered him. I think the trick to Bad Dudes is to get the nunchucks and don't die before you lose them, so you actually have them when you fight the bosses. If you have the nunchucks, then the final boss is like laughably easy. So after killing the Dragon Ninja, the helicopter lands and out jumps the President. So who landed the helicopter? The President? Did he overpower the pilot or something? Then the Prez, who resembles Bush in this case since Ronnie was out of office in '89, offers you a hamburger because hanging out with George Bush is pretty much its own reward. So Bad Dude's not a terrible game, but just one that seems sort of behind the times in the post-Double Dragon and River City Ransom world. If it weren't for the title and the funny bits of dialogue, I am pretty sure nobody would remember this game today. Okay, we've got a few RPGs today, so let's start with this one from Kemco, White Lion Densetsu. There we see the titular White Lion, and some pyramids in the background. Nowadays, people always talk about how, no JRPGs came out in the US back then, but a few pretty obscure titles did get US releases, and this is one of them, under the name Legend of the Ghost Lion. The intro describes the lion as a quote-unquote a white lion. Why it was changed in the actual title, I don't know. So Maria grabs a spear and decides to find her parents. I mean, how old is this kid? And there is the ghost of a dead guy trapped in the spear. That's pretty odd. Little child, dry your crying eyes and go out and stab some shit. That seems to be sort of the main plot of this game here. And what's going on here? She lives in a dungeon? Anyway, White Lion does things a little differently. Your stats are now described as Hope, Courage, and Dreams, or rather just Dream. Collectively, these stats are known as Vigor. And you also have a wood key needed to open the door. It's kind of weird that she lives in a dungeon and has locked herself into this empty room. However, she immediately falls off her bridge and is swept away, and she wakens in this land of dreams. I'd like to think this whole game is like a hallucination as she's drowning. Kind of like that was the idea behind that Chopin game that came out a couple years ago, I believe. As I mentioned, White Lion Densetsu is sort of obscure. It doesn't even have a Japanese Wikipedia page. I couldn't find many sources for info about this, but one thing I do know, this was actually based on a movie from either 88 or 89 called Pyramido no Kanada ni, White Lion Densetsu. The game's title screen was based on the imagery from posters, it seems, and we can see a couple of the game's characters in the poster art. Now, from this info you would guess the movie took place in Africa, but I couldn't find anything on this movie online. I'm quite curious to know if the game follows the plot of the movie at all. I mean, the game has fairies, werewolves, and orcs and stuff, and based on what I'm seeing on the posters, I just can't believe the movie is anything like the game. So if anybody out there has a video from the movie or has seen it, I guess let me know. So Ghost Lion is pretty eccentric. One way in which it is eccentric is the combat. It has its own unique and pretty annoying take on RPG combat. You have weapons, you start off with a dagger, but you don't equip them, rather weapons are used in combat as items. So to attack, you hit Fight, Tools, then select your weapon, and you need to do this every single battle. In another odd touch, whereas most RPG battles are pretty abstract, here every time an enemy hits you, we see the character wince in pain. And this is like some young girl getting stabbed by an orc with a spear or something. It's a little disturbing. White Lion has only one character in the party, sort of. You see, you can employ summons in this game, so well before Final Fantasy had summons, here they are in White Lion Densetsu. In another Final Fantasy-related coincidence, there is an enemy called Ifrit, or Iflit as the game actually calls him. But during battle you can call summons to fight alongside you. It's possible to summon multiple creatures during the same battle. In fact, for the boss battles, this is actually a good idea. White Lion pretty much copies the structure of Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy wholesale. You alternate between villages and dungeons. The first town is called, rather stupidly, Bread. You can buy bread here, by the way. The citizens here are complaining about a nearby goblin and some magic dust that he's stolen, so you head on over to the nearest dungeon, and sure enough, there he is. Here's a good example of using the summons. Use the lamp and Twana will appear, your main magical summon. He has both offensive spells like Bomb and status spells like Dark, or a little later, Sleep. When the summons use spells or fight, it drains their power, and they disappear when their power is down to 0. Another odd thing, after battles you get money, aka rubies, but no experience. So no experience, then how do you get more powerful? Well, your level, or hope as it's called, is increased by finding hope fragments. Each one raises your hope, which in turn raises your courage, aka hit points, and dream, aka magic points. And I believe you also have some invisible stats, like some kind of attack stat, since you seem to get stronger as your hope increases. But of course you also find or buy better weapons. The game's debt to Final Fantasy is pretty obvious here, as certain NPC sprites are pretty much directly copied from the first Final Fantasy game. The red mage here is rather blatant. Other graphics like the chest and the stairs are, again, pretty much taken directly from earlier games. Now, as I mentioned, there's no equipment per se, there's no armor or accessories, just items usable in combat. Aside from weapons, you have a few other offensive items, like there's some buff items, and there's the blue ring, which increases defense, bread, which heals you, and amazingly, there is no healing magic, as far as I can tell. I'm pretty sure that the only way to heal, other than visiting one of those fairy springs, that lake where the fairies hang out, they're usually found in villages, is by using the bread item. And bread restores only 50 points of courage, so later in the game you need to use a whole lot of bread to fully restore your health. And I'm sure this gets really annoying as your courage gets higher and you need to carry around tons and tons of bread. So White Lion Densetsu is an odd combination of cool, forward-looking elements and terrible old-fashioned elements. I mean, the summons basically allow you to customize your party each battle. There's a total of 11 summons, some use magic, others have strong attacks, and others are good at defending you. The whole system of no experience or equipable items makes the game pretty unique. Since the hope crystals are found only at certain set points in the game, you can't grind and increase your strength. On the negative side, the game is pretty user-unfriendly, especially the interface. To perform a single attack, you need to hit the button way too many times. You select Fight, Tools, then the weapon, then choose the enemy. That's a total of 4 button presses, and there's 3 more to actually get past the screens that explain that you're actually attacking the enemy. And each time an enemy attacks you, that's 2 more button presses, and when you actually win the battle, there's 2 more button presses. So that's about 11 button presses for a 1-round battle without using any summons. And if the battle lasts more than 1 round, then of course the number of button presses increases. That's a lot of button pressing. The world map is pretty big, 2 large continents and a couple small islands. The overworld is definitely more interesting than that of Phantasy Star 2. Eventually you'll encounter some pyramids, and the last battle is against the White Lion himself. Overall, it's a surprisingly decent game. If nothing else, the way it sort of mixes up the traditional JRPG formula makes it a unique game. Okay folks, Capcom Game Alert, it's Willow. As you could imagine, this did get a US release, rather quickly as a matter of fact, in December of 1989. Now you'd have to sort of think that Capcom must have used some crazy-ass custom chips in Willow, just based on how great it looks and sounds. I mean, that's some really good music. But no, as far as I can tell, the Willow cartridge contains nothing special. just the old MMC1 memory mapper. It's basically got the same guts as Legend of the White Lion. I guess it's just Capcom artistry at work, because I'd say that Willow has some of the very best presentation we've seen so far on this console. Willow doesn't exactly fit precisely into any genre. Most folks would call it a Zelda clone, and it is very inspired by Zelda. But it also throws in some straight-up RPG stuff. You get experience points, which raise your level and your stats. So it's essentially Zelda sort of nudged over a few notches in the RPG direction. I'm sure you all know this, but Willow is, at least in theory, based on the 1988 movie directed by Ron Howard. The story was originally conceived by George Lucas, who produced the movie with his frequent co-conspirator, Joe Johnston. Johnston, by the way, had a pretty decent career directing sort of lame movies, like Jurassic Park 3 and that recent Wolfman movie. The new Captain America movie is probably his most financially successful effort. Ron Howard was on a huge streak as well in the 80s, having recently directed Splash and Cocoon. That was the Don Ameche breakdancing movie. And despite the huge amount of hype leading up to Willow's release, it was not really the smash hit it was expected to be, at least compared to the previous Lucas-produced stuff like Star Wars and Indiana Jones. It was also a bit of a critical flop and earned Lucas his first Golden Raspberry nomination. Willow, along with Howard the Duck, was sort of those were the first films to kind of tarnish Lucas's reputation. It did receive a few different video game adaptations. There was a pretty much worthless computer game from Mindscape in 1988. This was just a series of mini-games based around scenes from the movie, some of which were literally guessing games. Then came along Capcom with two Willow games. The Willow arcade game was a pretty awesome side-scrolling action game in the post-Ghosts and Goblins vein. The arcade Willow followed the film pretty closely and took great pains to make the characters resemble their real-life counterparts. A number of scenes in the movie were faithfully depicted in the game, and while it's not Capcom's best arcade game of the year, that would probably be Strider, it was pretty impressive. Now by 1989, Capcom had learned that arcade games and console games were two completely different beasts, and that rather try to cram in an arcade game onto the NES, they produced two different games with the same title. Tecmo had been doing this with games like Ninja Gaiden, Capcom had already done Bionic Commando, and later Strider. The Nintendo Entertainment System Willow doesn't resemble the arcade Willow in the slightest. Hardcore Gaming 101 speculates that it actually started life as a completely unrelated game, and then had the Willow license added on sometime during development. That is quite possible. Even though Willow features a lot of the characters from the movie, the game does not follow the movie's plot whatsoever. The game begins in Willow's home village. Here you will talk to the NPCs, find a guy who gives you a sword, and then head on out. In the forest, you'll be attacked by monsters naturally. Battles play out much like in Zelda. Monsters appear on screen, and then you poke them with your sword until they die. For each monster you defeat, you get experience points. Once you have enough, you'll level up, and your hit points and magic points will go up. Willow is, I'd say, far more linear than Zelda. The world sort of takes place in a series of interconnected screens, much like Zelda, but everything isn't just laid out in a big rectangle. The world is divided up in sort of like various sub-areas, like towns, forests, caves, etc., and these are connected by paths. You're able to backtrack and even have something sort of like a teleportation skill later in the game, but it's not quite like Zelda where you can pretty much walk from one end of the world to the other in a matter of minutes. I suppose that much like Zelda, you have two major goals in the game. One of them is to simply keep traveling forward, which involves getting past various roadblocks by finding special items, talking to NPCs, and defeating the occasional boss. Here's one such boss here. Now, I don't want to criticize Willow for having easy bosses, but many of the bosses in Willow are quite easy. The most common attack type is simply throwing some sort of projectile at you. If you have the right shield, you can simply deflect these. The most important thing here is the timing. Your shield will not deflect if you are still in the middle of your attack swing. So there is a little window where your swing appears to be complete, but you're still vulnerable. So patience is important in these battles. Most bosses will yield some kind of item or helpful magic afterwards, and often the path to the next area is unblocked. The second major objective is to find better weapons and shields. These are often tucked away in treasure chests in the corners of dungeons or forests. Sometimes NPCs will give them to you. And they all have very video gamey names, like the Flame Sword, Dragon Sword, Kaiser Sword. Which makes me wonder, what is this Japanese fascination with the word Kaiser? I mean, how many video games have a Kaiser Sword or something in them? We saw in Final Fantasy there was the Kaiser Knuckle. But a Kaiser Sword is not a real thing, right? Well, without getting the newest and fanciest weapons and shields, you'll probably be toast in the next boss fight. Also, there is magic, which is, probably healing is the most useful, and there are various quest items that go into your inventory and pretty much do their sort of thing automatically, so you never really pay attention to the inventory items. Now, some enemies are really freaking annoying, worse than the bosses, like the skeletons with the shields that reflect or block most of your attacks. These remind me a lot of those guys in Zelda 2, and I just hate them. You are supposed to do a sword thrust as they attack you and they have their shield down, but still, I hit their shield so many times, they just drive me crazy. Oh yeah, and these guys, they pop out of the water, hit you, then come out of their shells and send projectiles at you. And then they'll fly at you again, and these guys, and most enemies, do quite a bit of damage to you. As you can see, you have a pretty substantial number of hit points, but they drop down really quickly. Here's an example of a roadblock. In the game, you need to get an item which allows you to breathe underwater before you can pass this point. Most of the NPCs are based on characters from the movie. You need to transform this guy back into his human form. However, you must be at level 13 to do this. This actually reproduces a scene from the movie, which drew a lot of attention at the time. Industrial Lights and Magic used computer graphics to recreate one of the first examples of the popular morphing special effect. This is a few years before Terminator 2. This blew people's minds back then. Willow was released in the middle of sort of like a CGI revolution in movies. Within a few years we would have the fully CGI living creatures in Jurassic Park. As mentioned, Willow really shines in the aesthetics department. At times backgrounds are animated, the music is very impressive, and there is just so much detail that the game really sort of comes to life. Here, for example, as you climb the tower, you can see the floors that you've already climbed below you, and then these torches sort of light up as you move along. In some ways, Willow seems to be imitating not Legend of Zelda, but looking forward to Link to the Past. It uses these soft colors, and almost attempting a pastel fill. Willow even swings his sword, much like Link does in that game. The game's world in Willow is also laid out much like Link to the Past, rather than the first Zelda game. Willow was promoted reasonably well by Nintendo. It ended up with articles in 3 consecutive issues of Nintendo Power, a preview, and then 2 detailed guides. As I mentioned, most of the magic and special items are really not that useful, but there are a few exceptions. Once you obtain the Ocarina, you can summon your buddy Poe, who will come along and pick you up and then drop you off at various locations throughout the game. This is useful for backtracking and filling up your health and magic before entering a castle or something. Also, you sometimes need to use magic to get past a certain point. These horrifying looking mouths in the ground will start attacking you, and the only way to get safely across is to transform into a monster, then they'll ignore you. As you approach the game's end, you need to enter a couple castles, each with a couple bosses. This guy is super easy if you have the right sword. And you'll remember this dude from the movie, I'm sure. He traps you and takes your magical stone thingy. Also, the Val Kilmer character is imprisoned in the jail with you as well here. He's a major character in the movie but barely appears in the game at all. Same thing with the baby that's going to save the world. Willow only encounters her once in the entire game. Now the music when you reach the final castle is quite amazing. I guess they used overtones or something to create that ooh 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 voice you can hear in the background. But all the music here is really good and sometimes a little eerie. It's by Harumi Fujita, who also did the music for the NES version of Strider and some of the Mega Man 3 music. Okay, you can see the full assortment of swords and shields collected. The game also does try to attempt to tie up a couple loose ends. Val Kilmer and the daughter of the main villain fall in love here, like they do in the movie. You then fight the skeleton-faced dude, and you also had to transform that guy back into human form once you reach level 13. But I'm pretty sure you also have to reach at least level 14 to beat the game, since the final boss, Bavmorda, can only be defeated using a particular magic spell, and if you are below level 14 you simply will run out of magic before she is defeated. And once you do this and you get the crest of the spirits, you can actually attack her using her sword. She's pretty easy to beat in the second half of the boss battle, and she begs for mercy, funnily enough. Yet of course, Willow is a cold-blooded killer and refuses to listen. And since this is not a Konami game, her castle does not explode at the end. So overall, Willow is a pretty fantastic game, and one that shows just what Capcom was capable of. I mean, we've had two Mega Mans, Bionic Commando, and now Willow, and up ahead there was the Capcom Disney games. Capcom was entering some sort of golden age around this point. I wouldn't put Willow quite on the same level as, say, Mega Man 2, but it is one of the best action-adventure games on the NES, and by today's standards, it can be a bit repetitive, and it is sort of long. A speedrun takes about an hour and a half, but still I would highly recommend it. Okay folks, here we have something called Hissatsu Dojo Yaburi. What's going on with this game? Well, first of all, you know what they say about laws and sausages. You don't want to know how they're made. Well, the same is true for Chrontendo, only the typical episode usually involves a whole lot more pig offal. A little secret, despite this thing being called Chrontendo, the games in each episode are not really played or edited in chronological order. In the case of today's episode, I played a game we're going to see very shortly, called Tenkaichi Bushi Keru Nagūru, well before Hissatsu Dojo Yaburi. I guess because the other games somehow looked less terrible than this. And in the Tenkaichi segment, I marvel at how the game is basically a fighting RPG hybrid, and how, oh isn't that crazy, the guys who made this game thought up mashing together fighting games and RPG. If nothing else, Tenkaichi was a unique idea. Well, imagine my chagrin loading up Hissatsu Dojo Yaburi and discovering that it is also a fighting game RPG hybrid. The one major difference is that this is using a horizontal side-scrolling world rather than a top-down one. But the basic underlying premise is the same. Based just on the cover art, you would assume that this thing was licensed from an anime or toy line or something, and as far as I can tell, it's not. I'm pretty sure there are no sequels or anything like that either. The publisher is Sigma. Prior to this, they had some arcade games under their belt. This was their first Famicom title. They released a couple more later, as well as a few Game Boy games and a few other things, nothing of any importance. You maybe have seen a Genesis game called Shadow Blasters. So how is Hissatsu Dojo Yaburi? Well, what do you think? I mean, take a look. Does this really look like a game that you want to play? Is anyone out there thinking, yeah, this looks fantastic? I bet it's an undiscovered gem on the Famicom. Probably not. This sort of thing is, pretty terrible. Controls are unresponsive, your character moves slowly. Even turning around to face the other direction takes like 1 second. So this is not exactly Street Fighter 2 Turbo. As you walk around, you encounter various guys who want to fight you. You get some kind of experience, which you can redeem to make yourself more powerful. There are also these buildings you enter where there's some kind of tournament going on and you have to defeat a bunch of guys in a row. Looking at this now, I realize that we did have some sort of quasi-RPG fighting games earlier in the system's life. There were a few side-scrolling fighting games with a plot, like Culture Brain's Hiru no Ken games, so maybe Tenkaichi is not as original as I thought. Well, anyway, moving along. Oh lord, why? Another baseball game? Already? 8 days after Shin Moero Pro Yakyuu, we have a new entry in another baseball series, Taito's Kyukyoku Harikiri Stadium, developed by Winkysoft. I'll admit, this title sequence is pretty stylish. The first game came out not that long ago, in June 1988. We later had a follow-up, more of an update than a sequel, and now we have what is, I suppose, the true sequel, Kyukyoku Harikiri Stadium Heisei Gannenhan. The Heisei Gannenhan means first year of the Heisei era. In Japan, a new named era starts with each new emperor. In 1989, the long-reigning emperor, Showa, died. In the West, we usually refer to him as Hirohito, and his son Akihito assumed the throne. The new emperor's emperor name was Heisei, meaning peace everywhere. Unfortunately, the 90s and 2000s were a troubled time for Japan as the economy crashed and the country became overrun by otaku who never leave their bedrooms. But the Heisei was at least a good time for Japanese video game companies, at least for a little while. So anyway, this, much like the first game, is a bit of a baseball simulation game. There's lots of stats, you can customize your teams. Mechanically, it plays very similar to the Moero Pro Yakyuu games. When I covered the first game in the series, I mentioned that the most interesting thing about it was the really cool cover illustration. The same is true here, even though this time we actually have like a neat 3D sculptural photo. The sequel also used little sculptures, but in the Super Famicom era, the covers became really ugly and dumb looking. So I guess we are sort of seeing the glory days of the series right here, at least in terms of cover art. So anyway, moving right along. So White Lion was a weird RPG, and here's another, from Namco. It's Tenkaichi Bushi Keru Nagūru, or Greatest Warrior on Earth, Kick and Punch, as demonstrated by all the kicking and punching in that game logo. And Tenkaichi Bushi is, are you ready for this, a fighting game RPG, more or less. It was developed by close Namco allies Game Studio, the company founded by Masanobu Endo, creator of Xevious, after he left Namco. So I mean, a fighting game RPG? Why not? We saw a tennis RPG on the PC Engine. So many options. Well, the first couple options are just the fighting portion of the game. One-on-one fighting to be precise. You pick your character, but I know this came out well before Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, and back then it wasn't sort of written in stone that fighting games had to have this really huge diverse roster of characters, but there's only one character here. Everyone looks exactly the same, except for the color of your outfit. I mean, the characters do have different moves. I discovered that the character I picked here has no jumping ability. But still, the fighting mechanics are very basic as far as I can tell. The single main player game is here, so we'll do a quick overview. Tenkaichi Bushi has this large overworld that you roam around on. You will often encounter random fights. Your character must have some sort of underlying stats which aren't really displayed, which explains how enemies can sometimes knock you out in 1 or 2 blows. Dying will get you sent back to the starting point. Walking around in a field almost always starts a fight for some reason, I guess maybe with a farmer who doesn't like you walking on his field. Though when the game begins you only have just one move, a simple punch. Also on the overworld you will often encounter these little villages. The villages almost look exactly the same, and there's one guy you can fight. And it appears that as you win battles your hit points start increasing, and you will eventually gain new moves. Battles, at least at this stage, are very button mashy. The only thing you can do is pretty much just walk up to the guy and start hitting him as fast as you can. An early goal in the game appears to be this temple. Each time you defeat a guy at the temple, you can then challenge a new, stronger fighter. But other than that, I didn't really encounter much here beyond random battles and very repetitive NPCs. Like I said, a lot of the villages have the exact same people in them. From what I gather, this is pretty much what the entire game looks like. So unfortunately, Tenkaichi Bushi is pretty impenetrable. I'm sure it gets better later as your character actually learns more moves, but from what I played, it was actually sort of annoying. Oh god, stop it. Seriously, this music is horrible. And look at that crazy map of the US. What the hell happened to Michigan? It's been reduced to some skinny little peninsula. Zenbei Pro Basketball is a basketball game published by Vic Takai and developed by Icom, who also did Vic Takai's Amagon and Hoops for Jalico. Vic Takai released it in the US as All Pro Basketball. The US map has had a bit of a makeover here, but it still looks like Canada has annexed most of Ohio. The game doesn't use any real names, of course, but in the Japanese version the names were quite fanciful. For the US game, some names were changed to make them more suggestive of the real-life team names, like the Dallas Stallions, the Los Angeles Breakers, or in the case of Seattle, they just up and called them the Sonics. So right up front, I'll just say, I pretty much hate this game. We've seen one very good basketball game for the console, Konami's Double Dribble, and Jalico's Hoops was pretty good. That was a half-court street basketball game, and even Sega's weird basketball nightmare was sort of fun. But this, well, here's my problem. Maybe Icom couldn't figure out how to program a basketball game that scrolled all the way across the court, because here's what they do instead. When the ball reaches the half-court line, the game freezes, and the perspective is flipped, as in the entire court is rotated 180 degrees, and the guy with the ball is moved to the other side of the court, and then the game unfreezes. And this has got to be the most awkward, confusing solution imaginable. If you were running down, you're now running up, and so on. When you have the ball, it's fine, because you can sort of, see where you're being relocated, but if you're on defense, your player simply vanishes for a second and reappears somewhere else. And of course, he is now also facing the other direction. Now I'm sure with time you can get used to this, but I found it really annoying to have to try to relocate my guy when he's moved every 20 seconds. And there are a few other issues with playing against the CPU. It can steal the ball very easily. If a CPU player just brushes up against you, bam, he has the ball. And there are of course also those mysterious fouls that sort of are randomly called on you. But really to me the deal breaker is the whole system of rotating the court. It's just too confusing for me, visually. Maybe it works for you, but I'm going to place this near the bottom of the list of Famicom or NES basketball games. Our last game from July 21st is another RPG, Faria Fuin no Tsurugi, or Faria Sealed Sword, from High Score Media Work. The only other Famicom game published by High Score was Zombie Hunter from 1987, I believe. This logo here is made out of the sort of cracked orange stone that's becoming a bit of a cliché. We've seen so many logos that look just like this. Now, despite being an RPG by an obscure publisher, Faria somehow got a US release from Nexoft, who I think were connected to ASCII, because they published some ASCII games in the US. The name of the US version is Faria: A World of Mystery and Adventure. This was developed by Game Arts, who got their start with Japanese computer games, such as Thexter, and later went on to develop several popular series, such as the Lunar games, as well as Grandia and Sylphid. So eventually they actually did have some serious RPG cred. It might not be clear from watching this, but your character is female. This is actually made perfectly clear from the Famicom box art, but the US box art totally hid this fact. Actually, the US manual gives you a bit of backstory to the game, such as explaining the sealed sword and all that, but does not mention anywhere that you are playing as a member of the fairer sex, unless you infer this from the armor illustrations, which all have chest plates that indicate the character is female. The dragon that this guy is referring to is apparently a dragon summoned by the sealed sword. Also, look at this guy's head. He looks kind of like the prince from Katamari Damacy. I wouldn't call Faria a plot-heavy game, but there is a bit of story here as well as some various plot twists. So you begin in the typical JRPG village, with the item shops and the weapons and the armor shops. There is no inn, but there is a hospital, I guess you'd call it. What's unusual is that Faria seems to sort of combine fantasy with sci-fi in a way a little bit different than most other RPGs at this time. I mean, yeah, you have the swords and whatnot, but there seems to be a bit of modern technology, such as the electric lights, which require batteries, or the magic glasses, which look vaguely steampunky, as depicted in the US manual. Faria is an action RPG. You have random and very frequent battles, but they take place on this little battlefield where you need to run around and stab them. The game does lift a few things directly from Zelda, but it feels a bit sort of like Falcom's Ys. In fact, during the end credits you see your character looks a lot like Aldo from the Ys games. The first order of business is to make your way to the first castle and ask the king about his kidnapped daughter, naturally. He then gives you a picture of her, and you see that she looks like a caterpillar, which is pretty weird. So you head out, start looking around for clues, kill enemies and try to level up and get some money to buy better equipment. However, you level up pretty darn slowly. I finally reached level 2 here, which granted me a whopping 2 additional hit points. I needed to kill about 40 monsters in order to reach level 2. Oh look, I found the princess. That was really weird. Eventually you make your way to the Tower of Gelv to retrieve some sort of magical doohickey. The towers are very much like the dungeons in Legend of Zelda. They're a maze-like series of interconnected rooms. Often monsters will appear and the door will be locked until you kill all the monsters. Toss in some fake walls which can be destroyed, some statues to push around, and you get a pretty decent Zelda-like experience. Though Faria is a bit more sadistic than Zelda, the towers are much larger and harder to navigate. In fact, the first one is 2 floors, each floor having an 8x8 grid, so it's actually about twice as big as the final Zelda dungeon. Alright, so at this point, when playing, I wanted to show a bit more of the game, but I didn't really want to do all the grinding required, so I used a password cheat that leveled me the hell up. Playing the game yourself without this cheat is going to be much harder than it appears here. Just like Zelda, you can acquire arrows. Also, there are all kinds of weapons I have, like bombs and whatnot. Normally you wouldn't get all this stuff until much later in the game. The princess turns out to be a fairy of some sort, but she looks sort of like a butterfly, so I guess that explains the whole caterpillar bit. You return her to the king, and you get some dialogue which makes you just a bit suspicious of the princess. Maybe there's something going on here. And at this point in the US version, you would finally learn that you actually are playing a female character, and possibly get really confused. The king had promised that the person who rescued the princess would marry her, but it turns out you're actually more of the king's type. Now the plot here actually kind of goes off the rails. Instead, the king throws a party and feeds the townspeople caviar, which turns out to have been poisoned, and the king informed us that he bought the caviar from a mysterious masked man. Now folks, don't ever buy luxury food items from a complete stranger who is concealing their identity. That just makes no sense at all. Aren't there less shady sources of caviar in this kingdom? Okay, so to save all the poisoned townspeople, you need to find the antidote, which is in some town across the quote-unquote ocean. You hire a ship to take you there, and it turns out the ocean is really not that big. This guy always blocks the path right here, so you can never go and check out those cats that are wandering around. If the huge towers were not bad enough, Faria makes you go through caves that are literally pitch black. Yes, seriously, check this out. And the game makes you do this on multiple occasions, and you have to buy a flashlight in order to see anything at all, and the flashlight is powered by batteries which die after a while, so you get stuck in complete darkness if you run out of batteries. Faria definitely has some old school RPG sadism to it. And then there's stuff like this. If a monster hits you, it will probably knock you off one of those narrow paths and you'll fall 1 floor down. The boss here is a rather silly looking scissor monster. Without all the bombs I have, he would be much harder. Once you've defeated him, you get this magic item which allows you to repair a broken bridge that was hindering your progress. As I mentioned, people sometimes refer to stuff like Monster Party as obscure games, but Faria actually really is pretty obscure. A quick check on eBay shows people asking about $40 to $60 for the cart only. This isn't the case in Japan, I guess. It must be pretty common, since the complete game in a nice-looking box goes for around $11. As mentioned, the developer Game Arts went on to make some big-name games later, but another name that is actually quite important you might notice in the credits is Akihiko Yoshida as the graphic designer. After this, he seems to have moved to Quest and later Square, where he was the artist or character designer on some games you may have heard of, such as Ogre Battle, Tactics Ogre, Vagrant Story, Final Fantasy Tactics. Eventually, he went on to the big leagues and became the character designer of Final Fantasy XII, so I guess you can blame him for that game's little Aladdin-looking dude that everybody hates so much. So we've got all this far in the game, so here's the ending. Courtesy of another password cheat. You'll notice your character sprite has changed. That's because the curse that transformed him into a girl has been lifted, so you can now run off with a fairy princess. At the very end, you get rewarded with these anime-style illustrations, the only time in-game the character is always shown as being female. So Faria is a clever and original game with an odd sense of humor, that's for sure. I mean, that's good, but these sort of old-school gigantic dungeons and things like pitch-black dungeons requiring flashlights might piss you off a little bit. And goddamn does your character ever level up slowly. So it's a weird combination of sort of progressive and regressive elements. But if nothing else, this game, as well as Ghost Lion, showed that video game RPGs in Japan were sort of slowly moving out of the massive shadow of Dragon Quest. Alright, here's a bit of an oddity. It's an adventure game based on a manga, but get this, it's a food-themed manga. Oishinbo Kyukyoku no Menu, or The Gourmet Ultimate Menu. The manga by Tetsu Karaya and Akira Hanasaki began in 1983 and is somehow still running today. It's basically about some serious Japanese food snobs. Normally a game like this would be pretty impenetrable, but we do have this pretty darn snazzy translation by the Snark. Now if you're expecting something a little different or unusual in this game, something that sort of shakes up the Japanese adventure game formula, then prepare to be disappointed. This is an absolute typical look, talk, and go style adventure game. Well, actually it does have a few funny moments later, as we'll see. But mostly you're just standing around listening to guys yakking about, foie gras and that kind of stuff. On a side note, California, the state that I live in, managed to recently embarrass ourselves, as we sometimes do, by actually banning foie gras entirely. For the most part, in this game, you're going to be doing the whole look, talk mambo. The game doesn't really give you much guidance at the beginning or any sort of clues as to what you're supposed to be doing. Your character is this guy named Shiro Yamoka, a reporter at the Tozai News. For some reason, you're working on preparing a dish for this gourmet food competition. You'll wander around talking to people, when during a conversation with your girlfriend and co-worker, Yuko, you hit upon the idea of monkfish liver, which is used in a famous Japanese delicacy called ankimo. The game then becomes a hunt for a monkfish. As I mentioned, the game does occasionally throw in some curveballs at you, like here, where an action menu unexpectedly pops up and gives you 4 choices: peep, yell, strike, and lie. Yell and strike really do nothing, but peep attracts the attention of a cop. You are then screwed and end up going to jail and getting a game over. Oishinbo does have moments where you get forced to make some arbitrary decision and will lose the game if you make the wrong choice. Here the correct choice is actually lie. Oddly, all you're trying to do is just speak to the chef at this restaurant, so I don't know why you can't just go up and knock on the door. From here you'll end up heading to the docks to book a fishing boat to catch a monkfish. I've discussed this before at length when covering other adventure games like Princess Tomato, for example. But in these Japanese adventure games, you have to do a certain number of things in a certain order, in order to open up new menu options and move the story forward. This means certain events will not happen until you perform some other action that isn't obviously or logically related to the result. I call these invisible or hidden triggers, but people might call it by other names. Christian Majewski of Game Design Review, for example, calls it invisible causality. For example, when you're looking for the captain of the ship, it turns out he's sitting in a bar, but you can't just happen to walk into the bar and find him. Instead, you need to look in a couple other places and ask some people about where he is. Once you've done this, the bar and captain will magically appear. This is frustrating because it often forces you to walk around talking to people and looking at things over and over, trying to find that hidden trigger. We have some more game over potential here. You can lose the game by giving the captain too much sake, but the game gives you no idea how much is too much. And when you've caught the monkfish, you need to prepare it in the correct way. Monkfish is, by the way, one of the world's ugliest fishes, but it is known for being quite tasty. I love this one. What happened? How exactly did you lose? And again here. Well, we do get some nice graphic fish gutting illustrations. Now once you get the liver out, you need to cook it the right way. The game did tell you earlier that Onkimo is steamed, but you are allowed to pick the wrong method. Once you've done this, in the next scene you surprise everyone by pulling out the fish liver. Now if you didn't steam it, everyone is disgusted and it's game over. Otherwise, you will win the contest and go on to Act 2. Oishinbo is reasonably long for this sort of game. There's 3 acts altogether. I mean, the subject matter is definitely unique, and it's fantastic that this was translated, but if you play it, don't expect anything too mind-blowing. It's our last game today. We close out July 1989 in Japan with a gosh darned bowling game, which is a little strange because there are hardly any bowling games on the Famicom, yet we just had one in June, Jalico's Big Challenge Go bowling game for the FTS. You get to create a character here, choose a guy or a girl, pick a name, even whether you're left or right-handed, and the weight of the bowling ball. Not too many sports games had these kind of options back then. One nice touch is the doubles mode. You pick your opponent here. Fred. I love the look, man. Freddie Mercury's stash with aviator headwear. Excellent. But I'm gonna go with Lucy, the purple-haired freak. This is like a futuristic bowling or something. The pins somehow get zapped into place by lasers. You also have this pretty elaborate control system. You can move your character left or right and then actually rotate the ball to control the spin. That's what the green ball on the right-hand side of the screen is for. You also have the standard power meter deal. Alright, here we go. That was easy. Perfect Bowling was published by Tonkin House, one of the guys that released about 1 or 2 games a year for the Famicom. I'm trying to think if they had any other notable releases, and nothing's really coming to mind. But it was developed, at least in part, by iSystem Tokyo. At least I think that's supposed to be iSystem, not AI System. iSystem is, once again, not a name that conjures up fond memories of excitement. They did a lot of console ports for Taito, as well as stuff like pachinko games for Coconuts Japan. Do not confuse them with ICOM, the company that did All Pro Basketball. So, what do you really say about a bowling game? I mean, I guess it's pretty good, considering the features of like putting spin on the ball. It's a nice, realistic touch. But I guess it's a little unbalanced. I mean, you have this power meter thing where you want to hit the button at just the right moment, and hitting it just a fraction of a second too soon will get you a gutter ball. On the other hand, when you get the timing right, you actually throw a lot of strikes. It seems there should be more gradation between the perfect strike and missing the pins entirely. Also, when you get a few strikes in a row, this nutty bird appears. If you're wondering what happens when you complete a game, well, actually nothing happens. You see the final score, and then it's back to the title screen. That's it. Altogether, I'd guess I'd call this a decent little bowling game. Alright, there we have it. One thing you may have noticed, we do not have one single FDS game today. We usually have 1 or 2 per episode, but this time, nothing. I keep predicting the death of that format, but it's not quite dead yet. There will still be a few more discs released throughout the year, and even after that, Nintendo and Takuma Shoten keep the thing going until 1991. So, what was our top game today? I'm going to hand out 2 awards, one for Willow for technical achievement, it's a damn impressive game, and one to Monster Party for creativity, since that is one nutty game. As for the worst game, well, maybe Airwolf, or maybe California Games? It's kind of a toss-up. So next Chrontendo, well, we've already seen the phenomenal rise of the RPG on the Famicom. Everyone is putting them out by 1989, and in July, the big guys themselves, Nintendo, released an honest-to-goodness Dragon Quest-style RPG, which became a huge cult classic. Also, we're going to see a US-only release from Capcom that's actually, well, not exactly well-loved, but it's pretty interesting. See you then.